Sir.
Good afternoon.
Would you please state your name and spell your last name for the jury, sir?
Sure, my name is Nicholas Roberts, Roberts.
And what is it that you do for work, sir?
I'm currently employed with a company called Thermo Fisher as a field service engineer.
How long have you been doing that?
Since November of last year.
Prior to November of last year, 2023, where did you work before that?
I was in the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab in the toxicology unit.
How long did you work in the toxicology unit at the Massachusetts State Police Crime?
Since October of 2014.
If I could turn your attention to prior to joining the lab for the Massachusetts State Police, can you talk a little bit about your educational background? Where did you go to school and what did you go to school for?
I have a bachelor's degree in applied forensic science with a concentration in chemistry and toxicology from Mercyhurst University. That's in Erie, Pennsylvania. And I also have a master's degree in forensic toxicology from the University of Glasgow in Scotland.
Now, after receiving your degree from the University of Glasgow in Scotland, where did you go from there?
I returned home to the British Virgin Islands, where I taught at a community college.
And what did you teach there?
Mainly chemistry and a term or two of physics.
Following your teaching in the Virgin Islands, where did you go from there?
I was hired then at the Mass State Police Crime Lab.
Now, when you're initially hired at the Mass State Police Crime Lab, you're working initially as a forensic scientist 1, is that correct?
Correct.
Can you explain to the jury what your duties and responsibilities are, what your work looks like as a forensic scientist 1?
Forensic scientist 1, you're essentially going through all the trainings that they provide at the lab. We do a number of different testing, mainly on blood and urine, looking for the presence of drugs and alcohol. We also do serum conversions and retrogrades. So during your training period, I started as a FS1. So that went up until I was fully signed off to actually write reports that would be issued to ADAs across the whole of Massachusetts, in which I became a forensic scientist 2.
What are the difference, sir, between sort of work as a forensic scientist 1 versus your work as a forensic scientist 2?
As a 2, you're essentially fully trained and you're able to do all the testing that we do in-house. You also are able to go and give testimony based on the reports that you write, whereas in a forensic scientist 1, you're still in that training process.
Did you work essentially as a forensic scientist 2 from that point in time till the time that you left the lab in November of 23?
Yes.
While you were working at the lab, was there an ongoing, continuing educational component?
Yes, we would habitually receive articles based on different discoveries within the forensic field, different ways they would find different types of drugs, different bodily fluids. Always a revolving door when it comes to drugs being discovered as well as being manufactured, what's illicit on the street, et cetera, et cetera. We would get different articles, just research papers based on what they're doing to discover these things within the matrices that we are looking at.
Now, in addition to that, while you worked at the lab, what, if any, are you familiar with the term proficiency testing?
Yes.
But what, if any, proficiency testing would you undergo while you were at the lab?
So we receive both in-house and external proficiency tests. Essentially, the process would be just the same. The only difference would be we'd have internal people sending us samples as if it came from an external source. The external proficiency testing that we receive is actually part of our accreditation. So it came in just like regular samples. We would test it accordingly, our protocols.
And as far as the proficiency testing that you undertook over the course of your time at the lab, did you pass each of those tests?
Yes.
Now, you mentioned a little bit as far as accreditation with regard to the lab. What accreditation did the State Police Crime Lab have?
We had accreditation. It's a nationally accreditation board for forensic scientists, as well as any kind of lab in particular, and the branch that our lab would have fall under. We have a certain set of rules that we have to adhere to. Mainly, it's a standard known as a ISO 17025, but we have a different accreditation board, and they have narrower requirements because of the type of lab that we are.
It may be pretty well understood, but that as far as the accreditation is concerned, that's done through an external entity. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, with regard to the lab, as far as your assignment of work, time that you left the lab, about how many forensic scientists were working within the lab in your toxicology?
By the time that I left?
Yes.
So in the toxicology unit, there was one more at the time that I left.
As far as you and the other forensic scientists, too, at the time that you worked at the lab, Was there some sort of rotation, or how were you assigned as it related to your work in the toxicology?
So throughout my time there, we had more forensic scientists, ones and twos, and we would delegate each type of assignments that we would look for to different types of testing. On a monthly basis, we would get a different group test that we would perform throughout that month, and it would rotate to the next person at the end of the month.
Sir, if I could turn your attention to May of 2022, you're working with the lab at that time, is that correct?
Yes.
Were you assigned to serum conversions at that particular time?
I was, yes.
At some point were you specifically assigned to a case involving a Ms. Karen Read?
Yes.
As far as a serum conversion is concerned, if you could explain to the jury what goes into that process and what is it that you're reviewing or you're looking at, how is a serum conversion, what is it, and how is it performed?
Sure. With serum conversions, usually what happens is that we get hospital results. So that would be the police or the ADAs would get results from the hospitals that whoever was attended to. We get the results. Usually hospital alcohol results they use serum in order to test alcohol. Serum is essentially the liquid portion of blood. So for instance, you fall and you cut yourself, that red stuff that comes out, that has serum within it. What the hospital does, they centrifuge it or spin it very fast in order to get the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and all kinds of the heavier materials out of that blood. What's left is a serum. So they use that to test their alcohol. What studies have shown is that we actually tend to have a higher alcohol concentration in serum than in blood. So what that means is that due to the chemical nature of alcohol, it likes to stay in that liquid portion more than throughout the whole blood. So the serum conversion essentially is able to convert the alcohol content from that serum that we get from the hospital into what it would be in whole blood.
Did you have occasion to perform a serum conversion in regard to Ms. Read's medical records? I'm showing you with documents. Recognize that, sir?
Yes.
What do you recognize that to be?
This is the serum conversion report that I made, where the calculations were made on May 3rd of 2022.
As far as the result that you received, what kind of materials did you receive in order to perform that analysis?
He got the medical records.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 106. Directing your attention to this last page containing this image here. Is that a portion of the medical records that you reviewed in regard to Ms. Read's serum alcohol level?
Yes.
What was reported in the medical records that you reviewed and using in your serum conversion analysis as far as the level?
The level was at 93 milligrams per deciliter.
With regard to that 93 milligrams per deciliter, was there also a time that specimen was collected as far as your review of those records? What was that time, sir?
It was at 9 in the morning, 9:08.
As far as forensic science, what you did at the lab, can you explain what that term means or what you did in relation to that?
What do you mean specifically?
That was very poorly phrased. Let me try to restate that a bit. What is your understanding of forensic science, and can you explain that?
Oh, forensic science is essentially scientific study based on anything dealing with the law. So whether it comes to ballistics or DNA analysis or toxicology, like I did, anything focused on the law or for legal purposes, essentially that's what forensic science kind of encapsulates.
Then forensic toxicology, would that sort of be a subset of forensic science?
Yes.
And can you explain to the jury sort of what your understanding based on your training and experience, what is forensic toxicology?
So toxicology in general is essentially just a study of poisons, plainly speaking. So anything that'd be harmful to the body, essentially that would be toxicology, because you also not only have forensic toxicology, but you also have like environmental. And the forensic toxicology is just, like I said, again, with the forensic science, it's just basing it on things for legal purposes.
Now, through your training experience, are you familiar with sort of the difference between a serum plasma level versus a whole blood level?
Yes.
And can you explain to the jury sort of what your understanding is of each and what, if any, differences there are between the two?
So plainly, your serum plasma level, or the serum plasma is what it's called. It could be referred to as either or one or the other. So that is just the alcohol level in your serum, whereas your whole blood is your alcohol content or regular BA in the whole blood. This difference between the two is, like I said previous, in your serum or plasma, that alcohol content would be higher as it would have been in the whole blood.
Now, as far as the milligrams per deciliter, how that's reported in the Good Samaritan medical records referencing Ms. Read that you reviewed in this case, is that typical as far as how hospitals would report serum plasma levels?
From my experience and all the times that I've seen serum conversions come to the lab, milligram per deciliters are the units that they use from the hospital, yeah.
Now, as far as that 93 milligrams per deciliter, with regard to serum conversion, what, if anything, are you then able to do to convert that to a BAC or a blood alcohol concentration?
On some studies, they came up with a few different conversion factors, knowing that the blood alcohol content would be higher than the serum plasma content. They're able to apply different conversion factors to the numbers that we would get in serum. We usually give a low, an average, and a high, being that it's kind of hard to say what one particular person's conversion factor would be between the two of them, since it's dependent upon like age, sex, the water content, what you had to eat that day. So it's harder to pinpoint, therefore we give a good range what it could possibly be, but just in case a person converts or their conversion would be a lot lower or higher, so we give a good range.
Those different conversion factors, where do those come from?
They are based on studies throughout the forensic world when it comes to looking at specific thing, blood and serum, to find that conversion factor.
As far as those studies are concerned, do they come from sort of different population bases? Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's how they were able to get the range of conversion factors that they use.
Now, as far as the water within the serum or how that works with the centrifuge, what relationship does that have to the thing that you get or the conversion factors that you use?
So the water content, essentially, if the serum being the liquid portion of the blood, water is also liquid, it makes up some of that serum that you get from it. Therefore, your higher water content, or essentially the lower the concentration could be of that, or lower or higher, depending upon whether or not your water content in that sample is lower or higher.
So as far as those different conversion factors that you're using, this is essentially a mathematical calculation, is that right?
Yes.
And so the different conversion factors that you're using for the low, the average, and the high, what are those conversion factors?
So the low is a 1.18, with the average being a 1.14, and then the high being a 1.12.
Based on your analysis, as far as the medical records and what was reported to you, using those three conversion factors, what, if anything, did you come up with as far as the low and average and the high for the 93 milligrams per deciliter?
So our values that were calculated for the low was a 0.078 gram percent. The high was a 0.083 gram percent, with the average being a 0.081.
Sir, with reference to the alcohol that's reported in the records, are you familiar with, are there different types of alcohol?
Yes.
And can you explain sort of what those types are and what the differences are or where they come from?
Sure. So there are multiple different types of alcohol, mainly based on the number of carbons that are within that molecule. You start off with methanol, which is one carbon. Methanol you can find in like some rubbing alcohols. We can find them in many different labs. We have big, large vials of them. Ethanol, which has two carbons. That one is the common one that is in our alcoholic beverages. It goes all the way up isopropanol, ethanol. It all depends on the number of carbons in the chain of it.
The type that's reported within Ms. Read's medical records, that was ethanol, correct?
Correct.
With regard to the training experience as a forensic toxicologist, are you familiar with a term known as a central system depressant?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury what that term means?
Sure. So alcohol is what is classified as a central nervous system depressant, and essentially name kind of gives it away as to what it does. Central nervous system is responsible for essentially all your movements, both involuntary and voluntary. So the way you move your head, the way you blink, the way you breathe, the central nervous system is responsible for all of that. With a depressant induced, it affects that central nervous system, causing things to slow down. So that's essentially what depressant means. It's going to slow down certain processes that a central nervous system would be in charge of. So you can have reaction times. It can cause drowsiness.
Ask another question.
How would that manifest as far as a central nervous depressant acting in the body?
Objection. I'm going to allow it.
Go ahead.
There are many different side effects from having a central nervous system depressant in the body. Lethargy, sleepiness, drowsiness, unable to walk properly, kind of any one of those tests that you see on TV from the police when they try to get your horizontal gaze and to make sure you're coordinated, it could affect all those things.
You're also familiar through your training and experience of working in forensic toxicology with a term known as retrograde extrapolation.
Yep.
And can you explain to the jury what you understand that term to?
So a retrograde extrapolation is essentially another calculation, but it allows you to be able to calculate what the possible blood alcohol content would have been at a time prior to when the blood was drawn. Say, for instance, blood was drawn at 2, you could essentially figure out what the blood alcohol content would have been at 10 in the morning prior to it.
And that's done with the calculation as well, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, what are some of the types of information that you would need to know or that you would want to know in order to perform a retrograde extrapolation?
We'd need to know, one, for sure, what alcohol content would have been. We also need to know the time that the blood was drawn, as well as the time of the last alcohol consumption.
What, if any, limitations are there in regard to performing retrograde extrapolation?
So when we do these calculations, anything that's shorter than 2 hours, we usually don't do that conversion.
And why is that?
Because we're built in within our calculations, we allow for 2 hours. That has to do with the way that alcohol leaves the body. If the alcohol is still being absorbed by the body, we want to give it enough time to get to a point where it's coming out of the body as opposed to increasing in the body. So that 2 hours puts the person at a point in which that alcohol will be coming out as opposed to it being absorbed.
So there are essentially 3 different sort of phases as far as intake of the alcohol into the body through dissipation. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a well-known kind of metabolism route to which the alcohol metabolizes out of the body, yes.
And so can you describe to the jury sort of that metabolism process as far as how it starts to its end point?
Sure. So with having, let's say, 1 drink, what the body begins to do at that point is absorb the alcohol. Usually you get a steady line that increases with time. So if you think of a regular chart where you have the level of alcohol in the body versus time, which would be on the y-axis or the x-axis at the bottom, as time goes along, after your first drink, the body starts to absorb alcohol. If that was your only drink and that was it, the body then at a certain point, it stops absorbing it because there's no more to absorb and it plateaus. So essentially the line goes straight. After that point, the body starts to eliminate it at this point. And then your level or your concentration of alcohol within the body decreases with time as it's getting rid of it.
And so there's sort of the absorption phase, the plateau, and then the elimination phase. Is that correct?
Yes.
You mentioned that in the course of your analysis for retrograde extrapolation, it's important to know sort of when the last drink was. Is that right?
Yes.
And why is it?
That way we can get a good time in and figure out the amount of time that has passed between the last drink as well as the time that the blood was taken.
Now, did you perform a retrograde extrapolation analysis with regard to Ms. Read's or the converted BAC from the serum conversion?
I did.
And so with reference to Ms. Read, as far as obviously the hospital records, you looked at the serum conversion report, what, if anything else, did you review or look at in coming to that retrograde extrapolation analysis?
We usually get a police incident report that usually identifies the time in which, per their narrative, what time in which they had the last drink.
Presenting you with the document. Do you recognize that document, sir?
I do.
And what do you recognize it?
This is the retrograde extrapolation report that I did for the subject of Karen Read.
Now, with respect to the time that you utilized in that report, when was the time that you utilized as far as the last drink or time of operation?
The time that was utilized as the last drink, it was at 12:45.
12:45 a.m., is that correct?
Correct.
And so you're using that to extrapolate from 9:08 a.m. when the 93 milligram per deciliter is reported from Good Samaritan to 12:45 a.m., correct?
Correct.
Now, with regard to that 12:45 a.m., what difference would it make if it were a little bit off of that? Say it was 12:30 a.m. or it was 1 or 1:10 a.m. What, if any, impact would that have on your conversion?
So we tend to go by hours. So we kind of round to the nearest, I think, 15-minute interval. A couple minutes or 10 to 20 minutes forward or behind of that 12:45, it wouldn't change the results by a lot.
Similar to the serum conversion, is this done with different conversion factors as far as a low, an average, and a high?
So we usually just calculate a minimum and a maximum for the retrograde, and that incorporates some conversions as well.
As far as the minimum versus the maximum, what do each of those sort of signify, or how do you come to those mathematical calculations?
So with the minimum calculation, we incorporate the 2-hour period. So we assume that maybe that 12:45, the body wasn't at that point in the elimination phase. So we allow it for 2 hours ahead of it. We also have a conversion factor. Once again, this is a study that was done to see the elimination rate of different people within the population. They would alcohol out of their system per hour. So we implied the lower limit, which was a 0.1 gram % per hour. With that 2 hour allotted, calculated time interval. Then we use the lower serum conversion number, the one that was converted on the lower end. We use all of that in the calculation in order to come up with the minimum. The maximum one uses the opposite. So it uses the higher serum conversion number with the higher elimination rate using the full amount of time.
And these calculations or these conversion factors are all based on sort of medical studies that you've reviewed in literature that goes into your training?
Yeah, all of it was part of the training, and they came up with those numbers prior to even when I was hired there. But it is based on multiple different studies in that, looking at that elimination rate.
From your calculations when it came to the minimum with regard to the retrograde extrapolation, what, if any, result did you come from with your calculations as it pertained to the minimum?
So the minimum amount that was calculated would have been a 0.135 gram percent.
That's essentially reporting in a blood alcohol concentration, is that correct?
Correct.
And with regard to the maximum, what, if any, result did you get from your mathematical calculations in regard to that?
The result was a 0.292 gram percent.
And so that range that you received, a bit of a wide range, is that fair to say?
Yes.
And why is that?
So we base those calculations, they're based on that conversion that I did from the hospital results from serum, giving us a good range of values in the first place. But then we incorporate the retrograde extrapolation one, which uses a time factor, and that 2-hour difference using two different nation rates, that causes a wider span of values. And it's just so that it can encompass essentially anybody within the general population, that they would be somewhere in between that lower limit and that upper limit.
Essentially, from those mathematical calculations, anyone within sort of the general population with that result would be somewhere between 0.13 and the 0.29, correct?
Correct.
Thank you, sir. I have no further questions.
Good afternoon.
You used a method called retrograde extrapolation to reach your sort of opinions and conclusions in this case, correct?
Yeah, it was a calculation.
And that means that you rely on an assumption that a trend will continue beyond sort of observable data.
So metabolism is actually pretty well studied. So we know that that elimination rate, unless you introduce more alcohol into the system, it declines at that rate, and it's pretty linear.
So in other words, certain assumptions are incredibly important for you to reach your analysis.
Sure.
And that includes the timing of the very last drink that the individual had. Is that right?
Yes.
If your drinking pattern is sort of different than what you assume for purposes of your calculation, then you'd agree that your entire extrapolation would be incorrect. Is that right?
It could be.
And again, those assumptions sort of included the time of the incident, right?
Yes.
And importantly, the time of the last drink.
So those two will be what we use. It's the time of the blood draw as well as the time of the incident or last drink.
And your report acknowledges that the testing that was used to obtain ethanol results in this case was not performed by the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab.
Correct.
And those results do not fall under your forensic lab accreditation standards.
Correct.
The Massachusetts State Police, as you testified, is an accredited forensic lab.
Yes.
And so you're required to meet certain minimum standards in order to uphold that.
Yes.
And you'd agree that those accreditation standards are different from accreditation standards that, say, a hospital lab might have.
They can be.
Do you ever work on testing within the Massachusetts State Police Lab for serum tests or whole blood tests?
So we did test blood and serum for alcohol content at the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab. Yes.
And their typical protocols are to use whole blood tests.
We use whole blood or serum.
In terms of the machinery that's used with the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab, you'd agree that the gold standard is gas chromatography and mass spectrometry.
Usually with a headspace detector, yes.
And that would detect whole blood rather than serum.
No, it just detects any volatile substance.
But you'd agree that a serum test usually, as you testified, has a much higher level than whole blood.
Yeah, due to the nature of the substance itself.
And so you kind of have to go through this extra step of trying to extrapolate, how do I convert this to get to whole blood?
So what we incorporated, anytime we had a serum sample submitted to the lab for alcohol testing, we actually did the same serum conversion in order to figure out what the blood alcohol concentration would have been.
And that's an extra step that you have to take using conversion factors, correct?
Yep, that's a calculation.
You're not actually testing for ethanol in the blood. You're testing for ADH, and then you have to do a conversion to get it to what a whole blood test would just automatically show you.
Yeah, so we get the serum level and then we convert it via calculation.
And typically in the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab, you would do what's called confirmatory testing.
Yeah, so we have a screening method as well as a confirmatory test, correct?
And confirmatory testing means that you take two separate samples and you test both of those.
Our protocol involved testing in duplicate. That's not always the case for the other drugs that we tested. We essentially have a screening test, which is one type of test, and then the confirmatory test would be a separate test, or sometimes even the same test, just rerun the sample again.
And the reason you typically would do two tests is to ensure that there's no error in the testing.
Correct.
And that acts as a fail-safe against false positives, and it also ensures that you're testing the correct sample.
Correct.
And in this case, obviously, you didn't conduct any of the testing.
Correct.
You're just assuming the accuracy of a single test that was performed by a hospital.
Actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
So if the clinical results are invalid, then your extrapolation is going to be invalid.
Yes.
You discussed a lot about sort of serum testing and conversion rates. Do you recall that testimony?
Yeah.
You'd agree that the precise conversion rate between serum ethanol levels and whole blood ethanol levels is almost impossible to accurately predict.
For each individual person, it would be difficult, yes.
And that's because the amount of water in our blood is scientifically impossible to predict with accuracy.
I'm not aware of any kind of test that would do that, so yeah.
Because individuals are different, right?
Yes.
So the conversions that you use are based on averages from scientific studies.
Yes.
But you'd agree that in certain instances, people can fall outside of that average range.
Yeah.
A comparison of, hospital serum alcohol levels, they range quite wildly. You agree with that?
Yeah.
In fact, you're aware that some studies show that a conversion rate from serum alcohol to blood alcohol can be as high as 1.59%.
I wasn't aware of those numbers, but yeah, it could range. That's why we give a wide range, and you could lie on the outskirts of either side.
And so that would mean that the actual blood alcohol content, once it goes through the conversion rate, would be much, much lower than sort of the average conversion rate that you relied on.
Yeah, it could be both higher and lower.
And that includes that range that you gave, right?
Yeah, it could fall within either range.
You'd agree that the more imprecise an extrapolation is, less reliable it is.
Yeah, you do have to base it on good. Your starting blocks have to be good. So you have to know the times in which the blood was drawn, the time of the incident, and essentially what your value was for your BAC.
And the time of the last drink, you'd want to know that?
So we would put that around the time, either the time of the last drink or the incident date.
And so the more unknowns you're trying to account for, you'd agree the less reliable your end result is going to be.
It could be, yes.
And you'd agree that the range you gave in this case, which was 0.135 to 0.292, that's a very, very large disparity.
Yeah.
Almost a 120% swing.
Yeah.
That would be the equivalent of, for example, predicting a child's going to grow somewhere from 6 feet to 14 feet.
Objection.
Sustained.
It's a very large number. You'd agree with that.
Yeah, there's a large range, like I said, due to the factors involved in the calculation. That's how it gets so large.
And that's because you're acting with a lot of unknowns in this case.
Yes.
You testified that your retrograde extrapolation assumes that Ms. Read reached the elimination phase of processing alcohol at or before sort of 12:45 a.m.
Yeah, we start for the maximum at the 12:45, and then it would have been 45 for the minimum.
And so for purposes of your calculation, if Ms. Read drank alcohol after 12:45 a.m. and before her blood was drawn at 9:08 a.m., your entire calculation would be invalid.
Yeah.
Mr. Lally?
Mr. Roberts, you're dealing with a time of incident that was known, correct?
Yes, it was given to me that it was at 12:45.
As far as the serum conversion that was coming from a medical record, that was known as well at 9:08 in the morning.
The time that the blood was drawn, yeah, that was known as well.
Now, as far as the question you were just asked, if the defendant drank alcohol after 12:45, does that include sort of shortly after 12:45, or how long after 12:45 would it take in order to affect your calculations or your retrograde extrapolation?
It's hard to say where that would have skewed it. It would have definitely caused a different time frame depending on how long after the incident or the reported last drink, if there was another drink in between there. It just shortened up the amount of time that would have been prior to the blood draw for sure.
What I'm asking is, would it have any significant impact, or would there be any difference if the last drink was, say, at 1 a.m. versus 5 a.m.?
So that'd be a 4-hour difference. So essentially that could, given the conversion rates, that would put the numbers very different. Yeah.
What I'm saying is, so the 5 a.m. would significantly impact your calculations, correct?
Yes.
The 1 a.m., would that significantly impact your calculations?
No.
All set, Ms. Little?
If I could just ask one question. You said that you were given 12:45 as the time that you sort of based your analysis on. And
Yes.
to be clear, that was not something that was provided to you by my client, right?
No.
That was something that was provided to you from a police report.
Correct.
No further questions.
Okay. All right, Mr. Roberts, you are all set, sir. Thank you very much.
No problem.